My name is James Boaden. I'm a lecturer in the history of art at the University of York, and I'd like to welcome you to this event for the Festival of Ideas, where I'm going to be talking to Robert Powell, who is a poet and a writer based in York. One of the reasons for talking to Robert today is the very generous gift of his archives to the Borthwick Institute at the University of York. This is an archive of papers pertaining to his career as a writer about photography, which we're going to be talking about here today. So perhaps, Robert, if I can just start by asking you a little bit about how you came to start writing about photography.
Yes, well, I was beginning a career as a freelance journalist. I was based in Manchester, and we're talking the late 70s leading up to 1980. And it so happened that I'd fallen in with a bunch of thieves who were photographers, including some really, really good ones, some of whom have become well known since, like Martin Parr, John Davis, Brian Griffin. I was in Manchester. They'd all popped out of Manchester Poly, which produced an extraordinary generation of photographers at that time in the mid 70s. And I was very interested in photography anyway, although I was not trained as a photographer, and I'm not even sure I had a camera in those days. But Martin Parr had encouraged me to enter journalism, and we had actually done some work together as well in Ireland and elsewhere for various newspapers. So I knew him. And one day he said to me, there is a big festival coming up in Salford being done by the painter, Salford-based painter, Howard Riley. And it was called Salford 80. And there was going to be exhibitions all over the place. And they were inviting two important photographers, one extremely well-known, André Cortege, and one less well-known, Russell Lee. And Martin suggested to me that there was a gap, there was a niche for people writing about photography. Nobody was reviewing exhibitions, etc. And so I went along to Salford 80. I approached the British Journal of Photography, which was a technical magazine, a weekly at that time, mainly keeping people updated about technology, but they were quite desperate to have copy about what was going on, not least in the north, far north, Manchester. So I thought, oh, as a Canadian, I can do the far north. Anyway, I approached the British Journal of Photography. They said, that sounds interesting. And I went to Salford 80 and I interviewed Russell Lee, who was one of the great photographers working for the Farm Security Administration, funded through the Roosevelt government in the Dust Bowl in the 1930s in the States. And so I interviewed Russ, and that was my first article in the BJP. And it continued from there, James.
I mean, what do you remember about Salford 80? I was just reading a little bit about it, sort of preparing to speak to you, and it sounded like a really kind of extraordinary event, and actually quite an unusual one.
It was unusual. You have to remember in 1980, this is before the establishment of the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television in Bradford, which happened 1984-ish. So really there was nothing big, and photography was in a funny position, you know, struggling to be represented, to be recognized in the art world as an art. And yet, of course, playing a huge role in society at the time. So it was sort of on the edge. So Harold Riley had a lot of connections. Salford, a very unlikely location in those days for such an event. So in that sense, it was very surprising, very interesting, and quite huge in scale. I went along with Martin. By the way, Martin Parr took that photograph of Russell Lee that you can see there in the upper left. I mean, Russell Lee was very unpretentious. He was very friendly and quite happy to talk about the 1930s and 40s working for the Farm Security Administration, along with Dorothea Lange and others who became famous as well. And of course, their photographs have lived on and are extraordinary.
From there, ended up writing more regularly for a number of different publications. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the kind of range of publications that you were writing for, which are represented in the archive.
Yeah, I think they can be divided in two. There were two commercial magazines. The British Journal of Photography I've already talked about, quite staid, quite conservative, but very keen to have I think it was, you'd find it in the offices of all the professional photographers in the country at that time. And it was a weekly, so they had a lot to do. Amateur photographer was more aimed, as the title says, at amateurs. So there was an awful lot about equipment, a lot of partly clothed women in it. And it kind of represented, yes, amateur photography, where that was at the time. And again, when I approached them, they seemed quite keen to strike a different note, to look at some of the artistic work going on around the country. So it was quite common for me to do an article about the British for the British Journal of Photography, and then do another one written slightly differently for the audience in the amateur photographer. And I was very keen to do that because I thought there was important work going on, and it was important for all sorts of photographers, the professional ones who were kind of stuck in their usual ways, and the amateurs who were stuck in their usual ways. Perhaps the occasional article about some of these wonderful younger photographers doing different things would sort of widen their appreciation of what was possible. And then there were magazines that were funded through the Arts Council, like Creative Camera and 10/8. And they would take a more critical, political, academic look at what was happening, and a more international look too, it's fair to say. So, I mean, it was a very rich field, James, in those days. I mean, I remember when I was writer in residence at Newcastle Polytechnic in '83, I organized a whole day, a whole event that was called, the magazines Where Next. So there were enough magazines around in those days, that you could get an audience to talk about these magazines, how important they were, and what they should be doing as opposed to what they were doing. And it was a fantastic thing. It was a very rich scene at that time.
And who do you think was reading these magazines? Was it people who were practitioners, people who were, well, amateur photographers, as the title of that magazine suggests, or how wide was that readership?
Well, Amateur Photographer magazine would reach a very wide audience. Everyone who picked up a camera, who wanted to know what lenses the famous photographers, especially fashion photographers at the time, were using. So there was a real fixation, a cult around equipment. And I think Amateur Photographer which would of course be full of ads from the manufacturers of equipment and film and chemicals and so on, catered to that market. British Journal of Photography, much more technical, looking very, very deeply into the latest techniques and very expertly. And of course, the British Journal of Photography goes back to the 19th century. I mean, I think it was founded perhaps 1860s, 1870. I can't remember. The other magazines like 10/8 came out of Birmingham, and I think it would have been read by younger people coming out of university, coming out of college, either practicing photography or interested in critical theory. And Creative Camera also had quite a long history. Colin Osman had founded it and run it on a shoestring, and then got a grant from the Arts Council. And I think it was a similar audience reading Creative Camera.
But I mean, thinking about your own interests, reading some of your texts over the last couple of weeks, you seem to be less interested, I suppose, in some of those more very technical aspects, and more interested, I suppose, in how photographs were circulating, which may well have attracted you to a photographer like Russell Lee.
Yes, I should explain now that I had no training in photography. My degree was in English literature, and my career, other than when I'm writing, has been in the visual arts, largely. So I had no background in it. So I think the stance that I took was kind of the sort of interested layperson, someone who might walk past the Impressions Gallery in York, look in the window and say, oh, that looks interesting. I'll go in and have a look. So I took this position, not in any camp particularly, and not bringing a lot of theory, let alone interest in technology or technique to it. I was looking at it as a citizen, I suppose. And I was very interested in photography's position in society and its power. So that was one of the things, as you say, that I pursued once I was a journalist, and then when I became a curator as well. The power of photography, how it spread, how it affects us, whether it's historic or contemporary, and how the contemporary and the historic are linked. But we can talk about that a little bit more. But I was mainly interested in, the artist photographers who were busy at work and exhibiting in quite an extraordinary network of galleries that had been set up around the country. In the north, you had Impressions Gallery in York, which was the second one, set up. And I think it was 1972. Val Williams and Andy Sproxton set it up. Martin Parr did one of the first exhibitions there. So again, you can see me following Martin's trail there too. And only one gallery in the country, the Photographers Gallery in London, had been set up before that, probably 1971. There were galleries in Newcastle, Side Gallery, very interested in documentary photography, Spectro Arts Workshop, much more art-based and conceptual. There was a gallery at the Brewery Arts Centre in Kendal. There was the Open Eye Gallery in Liverpool, where I discovered the work of Schomburg Hardman, which we could talk about a bit maybe. And there was Stills Gallery in Edinburgh. And there were many others throughout the South. So photography had come to a certain point of interest. The early 80s, very, very interesting time to be in Britain and looking at photography.
I mean, this sort of scene of various different small galleries in places outside of London is really interesting, I think, to think about, because it although most of these institutions actually do still exist, they still exist in a very different form to the way in which they were existing at that time in the late 1970s and into the mid 1980s, where there are different sorts of funding routes perhaps available to them. And I wondered if, I mean, that's partly why I kind of put this slide in of the interior of Open Eye Gallery, which was a converted pub, and the kind of shape of it still looks an awful lot like a pub, even though it's got these photographs on the walls there. And I kind of wondered if you could talk a little bit about what, how interconnected these spaces were with one another, whether they were kind of programming in conjunction with one another. I mean, was it really a scene, or was this something which was much more kind of locally based for an audience in the towns where these institutions were working? Because you're somebody who was traveling between them an awful lot to see different spaces.
Well, I think it was a bit of both. I mean, each of these galleries had a strong identity and reflected, one way or another, local interests. They created a healthy ecology, really, which I discovered later when I became director of one of the galleries myself, the Stills Gallery in Edinburgh. Because if you made an exhibition, you could tour it. You could guarantee that the money that you put into the exhibition, which was mainly Arts Council and maybe local council funding largely, that you could get some of that back by touring the exhibition to 5 or 6 venues around the country. So it was both a network, but each one also had its identity and its sense of locality. Open Eye, very much Liverpool, but very keen, to show work from beyond Liverpool as well. Stills Gallery in Edinburgh, very Edinburgh in a way, very art based when I arrived, quite precious about photography as an art form, doing fantastic exhibitions. I mean, importing work by Man Ray, for example. Um, they were doing extraordinary things, but it was kind of very precious, and I took it in a different direction during the 3 years I was there. So in answer to your question, uh, they were all run on a shoestring. There would usually be one person or a small group of people supporting them. When Stills Gallery had a valuable exhibition, because of insurance, the trustees of the gallery used to sleep in the gallery overnight just so that the insurance issue would be looked after. So there wasn't a lot of money around. There was a lot of dedication, and the directors of these galleries, worked very, very hard, I think, and they would be supported. And then there's the issue of dark rooms, giving access, cheap access to dark rooms was something that a lot of the galleries did also. And that, of course, created audience and extended the reach of the gallery, but also gave access. And some of them gave access to people who wouldn't even be able to afford a camera. So there were a lot of community arts groups with or without galleries going on in places like Bootle, Bath, etc. Trying to put cameras into the hands of young people, working people, and seeing what happened. And sometimes what happened was quite extraordinary.
And there's a sense, I suppose, with some of these exhibitions that they're really kind of attempting to reflect their own audiences in different ways. So very often with, as you say, sort of very, well, I think we probably could say kind of leftist ideals in the case of some of these institutions, often coming from quite politicized kind of grassroots organizations, certainly the case with Open Eye. But choosing exhibitions which perhaps wouldn't have been shown somewhere like the Victoria and Albert Museum, which had quite a different idea of the audience who were coming to see it, whether they be practicing photographers or just somebody walking along the street in York who might come in and see the exhibition at Impressions, for example.
Yes, and I think that eventually the influence of the approach these galleries took cumulatively had an impact on organizations like the V&A, whose curator, I mean, he was keeper of prints, he was known in those days, Mark Hayworth Booth, was very interested in some of the photographers emerging from the support given to them by the Side Gallery in Newcastle, by Stills in Edinburgh, etc. And the V&A began to purchase this work, which of course they still have. And Mark was very keen on that. So he was trying to open the V&A's eyes, I think, to photography and its power, and he was making a lot of progress. I think the other thing is the opening of the National Museum of Photography, this idea that museums wouldn't all remain in London, but you could open a major one in the north. That was quite extraordinary at the time too. And I think rather than putting it in political terms of left and right, I would say it was around democratization. I think you could say that. That's certainly where I was coming from. It's not to say I was apolitical, but I was just very interested in how photography was affecting people's lives as consumers of goods, and also as consumers of history and politics too. I'm not sure if I've answered your question or sort of gone off on a wander there, but the institutions were different. They were very staid, a curatorial tradition, and their audiences were limited, I think. And if you look at them now, if you look at the V&A now and the approach it takes, and all the other galleries too, they're much more open and interested in their users, interested in widening, that. So it's funny, your question has caused me to think that all this grassroots work around the country did have an impact on the major institutions.
Yeah, I think for sure. Are there any particular exhibitions that you really remember reviewing from the time you were writing extensively in photography?
Well, I mean, I won't begin to mention, many of the photographers who I discovered because there's too many, really. I'd have to say, uh, self-critically, that it was a bit blokish maybe in those days, although feminism was beginning to find its voice through photography also, and there was terrific work being done by uh, you know artists like Joe Spence, Karen Knorr, and I was aware of that, and indeed I talked about their work when I gave talks. But my own interest was more representational, I suppose, side of photography rather than conceptual or art for art's sake photography, and that was my particular interest. Um, I'm trying to remember exactly what you've asked me. What was the last question?
It was about which exhibitions
Okay.
really stuck out to you.
Yeah. Well, there were too many good ones, but one I remember particularly was curated by John Taylor at the National Museum of Photography, Film, and Television. So imagine this huge venue opening up in Bradford, which was on its knees by the mid 80s. I mean, we're talking about the Thatcher period, we're talking about huge unemployment, deindustrialization, uh, struggling northern cities. Here's this incredible institution set up. And John Taylor did an exhibition, I can't remember the title, unfortunately, but it was basically looking at landscape um, at the tradition of British landscape through photography, using photography to examine the myths and hidden truths about the British landscape, how it had become so chocolate boxy, who really owned it, taking a real critical look at things. And I think it was a very brave exhibition for a national museum to put on, because it was quite political. And it really opened my eyes to the role of photography as a powerful force for making myth, for hiding things, and for writing history in a certain way. I can't remember whether I'd already done the Brunel exhibition at Watershed at that time, or whether these things were happening in parallel, but I think John came from a much better informed perspective than me. He was a professor at that time. Very, very smart work. And, a magazine like 10/8 would do a whole issue almost based on that exhibition. So there was this effort to disseminate and reach out going on. So that's one I would pick. And I suppose I would pick it because it educated me. I mean, I was learning all the time from photographers and from exhibitions. And these helped me when I eventually became a curator of exhibitions and a gallery director myself.
So perhaps if we just move on to talk about some of the photographers who were very important to you, right from the beginning of your career. You've already mentioned Martin Parr, and we've got a few images from his series, the Nonconformists, which you reviewed for the British Journal of Photography.
Yes, of course. Yeah, no, carry on.
I mean, I just kind of wondered, because Martin Parr now is a kind of incredibly famous photographer. He's somebody that everybody would recognize as one of the great British photographers. I mean, at this point, in the early 1980s, I mean, he was fairly well known, but much less so than today. And I kind of wondered what you made of these images at the time. Images largely taken around around West Yorkshire, and whether you whether you recognised that landscape within these photographs.
Yes, well, where to start? I mean, Martin was clearly an artist, a man on a mission, really. He was completely committed to the medium, um, and pushing himself very hard, looking for opportunities and looking around himself and trying to capture it. One of the first exhibitions that I reviewed was the Nonconformists. You can see a picture there from it. I mean, and of course, I was living in the north, so I had access to all the towns around Hebden Bridge, Halifax, etc., where Martin was working. And to speak personally, I mean, I was a expat Canadian, you know, who'd chosen this country and learning about it all the time. And so a lot of these photographers, including Martin, I learned about the country, its past, its present through them. But the thing about Martin was there was always something a bit extra. I mean, if you look at this photograph, I mean, it's bizarre to think of people sitting watching rugby in this overgrown, outdoor, derelict place. But look at the man walking away from the game and how the chemistry of photography causes his upper half to almost begin to disappear into the air. And this may be the poet in me that was always there and has come out, of course, more lately. But there's a metaphor going on in this photograph, and that's quite typical of his work, that in addition to its documentary value, there's something metaphorical and poetical often going on within it. So I was fascinated as an expat, learning about my adoptive country, and also as a poet about the power of photography to be poetic, to be metaphorical, to carry far more than it first appears to do.
And it was interesting to see that this exhibition that you were reviewing took place in London at the Half Moon Gallery, and I wondered whether there were, because your beat as a reviewer was largely in the north of England. Do you think that there were different reactions to these photographs in the south of England than there were up here, or do you think that that's a bit of a generalization?
Sure, I think there was a difference. I think the north and what some of these photographs showed would have been seen as quite exotic and otherworldly in the south. That, by the way, is the chapel up on the moors where Martin and his wife Susie spent a lot of time documenting the lives of the fast dwindling congregation at this extraordinary site, high in the middle of nowhere, above Hebden Bridge. That's the Methodist chapel there. So yes, I think it was it was an alien country from which many people they would have found it almost moon-like, I suppose. And of course, this North and South business goes on now. Nothing changes in some ways in this country, because now we have a government very keen to even up, level up, and so on. So the debate goes on. Half Moon, of course, was a collective and very political. I mean, fair enough to call that a socialist collective, I think. And they were interested in community photography and communities. And I think maybe they asked me to review that, or maybe Martin suggested it, because, you know, having known him, I kind of could write about his whole approach and the context from which these images came.
It's an image from a later series.
Well, of course, this was like Dylan, you know, like Bob Dylan going electric when Martin Parr went from black and white to color. And of course, this was, I mean, he was also, I think, very conscious and somewhat wounded, perhaps, about being accused of satirizing working class people, which we won't get into a debate about that now, but he sure had a go later on in his career. You can see this is mid 80s at the middle classes and upper classes too, and had switched to color. He was very interested in what was called the new color, coming from the States, photographers like Ecclestone and so on, using color in quite an extraordinary way. And of course, Martin, has experimented a lot with that since. So, he took all his talents and skills to other fields and other social settings, shall we say, once he'd left Hebden Bridge and Ireland, because he spent 3 years in Ireland as well before this. John Davis, an extraordinary skilled photographer, graduated from Nottingham Polytechnic. And the interesting thing about John's work was that he started off photographing what we could call the classic British landscape. I think there's an image of his Lake District. So he brought extraordinary skill, photographic skill, to doing this kind of work. And then he took his I suppose, extraordinary eye, this kind of interest in looking things in an overview perspective, and he began to apply that to post-industrial landscape. And that was quite revolutionary, I think, at the time, because this sort of landscape was all around us in Manchester, Bolton, Sheffield, etc. And in his photography, there are stories. There's a strongly narrative. In this case, you've got the ghost of a bridge, heading across a body of water towards the ghost of a mill. And he captured contemporary and historic within single images. And if you go back a couple, you'll see his first book, A Green and Pleasant Land, which I wrote an introduction to. And I followed John on some of his missions out to take photographs, and I wrote about photographers at work, how they approached it and so on. And people were hugely interested in that. But again, personally, I learned a lot about the landscape I found myself living in through this photography, which seemed to capture the whole of the last 150 years of British history, from a rural landscape to completely industrialized landscape, to that landscape beginning to fall apart and be abandoned. So very, very evocative. And then as a curator and journalist, I worked with John for Rochdale Art Gallery, following the wake of King Cotton. And that's the catalogue there. And of course, these exist now in the library at the Borthwick or at the university. So what we're showing everyone exists in some form there. And of course, needless to say, I'm very pleased to have donated this material, so other people can have a look at it who may be interested in this aspect of British photography at the time.
Absolutely, and we're very grateful to have it. I thought this photograph was amazing by John Davis. This power station.
Yeah, we actually have this photograph too in our living room, so I look at it quite a bit. John, according to John, it remains his most popular ever photograph, but always again in the detail, you'll struggle to make it out, but in the foreground near those parked cars, there's a horse parked as well. So you've got this kind of reference to travelers and an itinerant Britain, again, an older Britain, and the trees talk about landscape and rural and nature. And then in the background, you've got these megalithic structures, power station, demolished now. I mean, if anyone's interested, John Davis, like many other photographers, has gone back and visited some of the sites years later, decades later, and this site has been utterly transformed. And of course, you've got a football match going on in the foreground too. Amazing picture, really. So that was another photographer who I was lucky enough to know and work with, and from whom I learned a lot. And I think his work is extraordinary and remains so.
Brian Griffin was the other photographer that you mentioned to me.
Yes. I mean, these are just examples. I mean, there are dozens of great photographers, many of them forgotten now, doing important work. But Brian's important. I don't know whether anyone's looked into this, but I think Brian Griffin transformed portrait photography in this country. And I mean, I did curate an exhibition from Stills Gallery, which eventually went to the National Portrait Gallery as well as other venues too. So he certainly was recognized at that time. He started off doing rock music. So this is Susie from Susie and the Banshees. And he brought extraordinary skill to it. And again, I think if I was a student now interested in photography, I would be quite interested in trying to trace Brian Griffin's influence on how portraits, commercial portraits, are taken in this country now.
And very different.
Yes, I mean, he was greatly influenced by film from the 20s and 30s and 40s. So his lighting in the studio was extraordinary. But then he began to do almost theatrical mise en scène. But the interesting thing, James, about Brian was this. Whereas the other photographers found themselves usually funded through public sources like the Arts Council, Brian had an extraordinarily successful commercial career. So this, what would seem to be an art photograph, he's actually commissioned to make by rich developers, at that time developing Broadgate in London. So he was able to be well paid for his work, to take commissions, and yet to bring extraordinary artfulness and meaning, sometimes I would argue quite subversive meanings, to his commercial work. And I think that's another interesting thing that is worth looking at too. But of course, it's a spectacular image on any count, really. Set up almost like a film set. This is more typical of his studio. Again, this will be a singer. I mean, I'm really sorry, I've probably forgotten. This will be a rock musician of some sort, and Brian is bringing this kind of weirdness, almost Transylvanian, weirdness to it. Is his work. So fascinating. And I think in the collection now, there are books by Brian. There's a couple of posters from his work as well that anyone can access in the Borthwick.
And then you also included, when you were sending me some images, some anonymous images, which is also something that was of interest to you.
Very much so. I am interested in history. Why else live in England? Why else live in York? I'm hugely interested, and that's one of the things that drew me to this country. So when I got into photography and understanding about its history, I was and I remain fascinated by anonymous photography. These are carte de visite, quite tiny. Carte de visite from the Victorian period. There's the original. I still have it in my hand, and I love to handle these things and wonder who this little boy was. And I've written a poem about this. So my interest in this carries on, and I just thought we should drop it in, because eventually, of course, this interest in history then was exemplified in some of the big exhibitions that I moved on to.
Yeah.
But I love this stuff. I'm going to show you another one. I'm going to indulge again just a little bit more, although I guess we're running short of time, aren't we? But just have a look at this, found in a junk shop. And what you've got is a photograph, and then glued into it, photographs from elsewhere, other photographs. So somebody has cut out photographs from elsewhere, glued them in place next to this chap in order to create what I presume to be a family portrait. And again, as a poet, I've written about this image too, but this sort of thing, done, put in a cheap frame and so on. It's very touching. It's very, very moving. about photography in ordinary people's lives, I think.
We probably should move on to talk a little bit about your curatorial work, which in some ways emerges quite directly from that writing. I mean, you mentioned earlier on that Edward Hardman was a photographer who you had written about, and who had been kind of discovered um, around about 1980 with this exhibition that took place at Open Eye Gallery. A photographer who was in his 80s at that time, and it hadn't really been displayed as an art photographer per se. I mean, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about this exhibition. We've got a few slides and installation shots of it. I'm very interested to know, so for people who don't know, Hardman's house is now preserved by the National Trust. You can go and visit it. It's sort of seen as a sort of a relic of a different way of making photography, of the kind of industry of commercial photography. I mean, you met Hardman when you were putting together this exhibition at the Photographers Gallery, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that experience of what that house, which now we can go and view and it's all kind of cleaned up and lovely, what it was like to go and visit that at the time, and why this particular image of the Ark Royal was so compelling to you.
Yeah, so like we could talk about this image for a long time in Hardman and that whole story. Just a little bit of a plug. I mean, this stuff doesn't stop. So I've written a short story based very strongly on my visits to that house. And it's just been published in a new journal in York called the York Journal. So anyone interested in this or in literature or in York can look up the York Journal, because it's just fresh off the press now. The house was extraordinary. I visited it several times and became a friend, really, and supporter of Edward Hardman while I was based in Manchester. When I moved to Edinburgh, of course, it was more difficult, and he died eventually while I was still director of Still's Gallery. I don't know where to start, James. I mean, this was a little exhibition commissioned by Rupert Martin at Photographers Gallery, London. And I think they wanted to look at particular individual photographs and put them in context. So you can see here, this is the leaflet that was produced, Photographs in Context, #1. And what I did was, I suppose, was an act of deconstruction, what I call deconstruction without theory. So unlike the graduates of the Polytechnic of Central London and students of Victor Bergin at that time, I had no theory about deconstruction, but it just seemed to me a logical approach to this extraordinary photograph that seemed to me to capture the whole history of the country over the past 100 years in one single image, and also just tell this compelling story about a little boy walking down the street under this phantom of modern technology, the new Ark Royal. So he's walking through this classic northern rundown Victorian street. Look at the Victorian gas lamp on the right. And yet hanging on is the future of the country, and of course a military one. So the approach I took was to, first of all, put this photograph in the context of Chamberlain's other work, then talk about the military aspect and political aspect of weapons of mass destruction like the Ark Royal, and the workers who were making the Ark Royal. So we found photographs from the Camel Laird archive of the guys who were actually making it, and then the death of the shipyards. So just there on the right, you can see shipyards want cash injection because they were all struggling at the time. And then also the exhibition very quickly put all of this into a political context of the Falklands War, which was happening at the time, or just about to happen, or going on. So it was a little exhibition that kind of took on a lot. And to me, this was just a logical way of looking at photography, looking underneath it, looking into it, looking around it. And I'm very pleased to say, I mean, this little exhibition traveled around the country for years afterwards. And as you mentioned, James, I didn't know this, but it's on the Photographers Gallery website too, for anyone who wants to have a closer look. But then the Watershed in Bristol, a year later, gave me a bigger opportunity, or an opportunity to do the same thing, but on a much bigger scale. So it was the 150th anniversary of the Great Western Railway, which was Brunel's great railway project. And again, on a much bigger scale, I looked at the image, the classic image of Brunel with the chains. I looked at workers in photography, or rather the absence of them in 19th century photography, and how that reflected class values at the time. We looked at the Clifton Suspension Bridge. We asked people to send in snapshots and photographs of the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which was designed by Brunel, and that brought a celebratory aspect, an engaging aspect to the exhibition. And then I think perhaps most interestingly, well, yeah, we looked at photographs by Robert Howlett of the Great Eastern, because this was at the time when photography was on the edge of becoming a mass media. So Robert Howlett took photographs of Brunel's great ship, great failure of a ship, the Great Eastern, called the Leviathan at the time. These were quickly made into extraordinary woodblocks and published in the London Illustrated News. So it was the beginning of mass journalism, really, and photography's just starting its journey to become the powerful medium that we know today. And then finally, I also looked at the heritage industry and how that image of Brunel was creating myths about the Victorians at a time when the Thatcher government was talking about Victorian values, and huge changes had happened in the country. And this backward looking aspect that still haunts our country, and the use of the image from its beginnings through postcards, chocolate boxes, to the heritage industry, and the whole politics of Victorian values. So again, this time I was given we were given a whole gallery. And I just want to say that in terms of the Borthwick collection, most of what I gathered, my notes, Xeroxes of the photographs that I was finding in collections all over the country, a lot of that is well represented now in the collection. And so anyone who wants to dip into it, it's well represented there. We could have just a quick look at some of the posters if you want, James, if you've got another burning question.
Well, I suppose maybe while we flick through some of these posters, one of the things that you reflect on in the catalogue essay for Brunel's Kingdom, you ask this question in the mid-1980s, how do we look at this photographic material from the Victorian period at a time when we are saturated with images, and where we barely think about photography as photography. And I thought that was a really interesting question to sort of reflect on a little bit again now, because if it was ubiquitous then, it's even more so now. And I suppose in some ways, well, the way that I would think about the shift from that period to now is that while we were kind of living in the 80s in a kind of image saturated moment, now we're also makers of images ourselves. So almost everyone is a photographer in a way that actually I'm not quite sure people were in the same way in the 70s, 80s. And I kind of wondered what you thought the place for institutions like the ones that we've been talking about is now for thinking about photography. And I'll just flick through some of these images perhaps some of these posters while we're talking about this.
Well, I think the role that those galleries played, and my writing in a small part, and all the other critical thinking going on at the time, I think it's the same. Institutions still have a duty I think, bring a critical eye to what we're doing so that we understand as we take photographs what we're doing, what we aren't doing, but also when we come across photographs, selling things to us, selling people or politicians to us, to be asking questions about where's the photograph come from, what's its motivation, who's paid for it, and things like that. So certainly now, I mean, if these questions were important then, they're even more important now that we are, as you say, saturated with imagery. So I think there's still a powerful role for these institutions, and I think it goes beyond looking at photography as just another art. I think it's very, very important to understand photography's role in a sort of wider way. And of course, collections like the Borthwick and courses like those at your university are also important too, and I'm sure are passing on this way of kind of deconstructing imagery and understanding the power that's being wielded when photography is wielded at us or by us.
Sure. I mean, certainly what's very important to me in my own teaching is to not just think about things in terms of art photography, but to think more broadly about how photographs operate around some of those artist photographers. And that's partly why I find your materials so absolutely fascinating, because you're really kind of thinking that way through your curatorial work and also through your writing.
I was very pleased, having carried them to Canada and back a couple of times. I was very pleased to find a home for my poster collection. I mean, think about these galleries around the country. You would make an exhibition like this one, and then you would run off a couple of hundred posters and send them around the country. And you might find yourself at, Southampton Art Gallery or something like that, and one of these posters would be up at the time. And I've donated quite a few of them, so I do encourage people to have a look through. There are some from Impressions Gallery. I think we saw one earlier. I mean, Impressions was very, very important, and of course still goes on in Bradford. Yes, so this is Angus MacBain, great theatrical photographer. And here's a poster actually signed by him as well. So there you go. You can't get better than that. Impressions Gallery of Photography. They were at Colliergate by that time. This one, yeah, Behold the Man. Oh, I could talk about any of them, really. Now, this was the biggest exhibition we did at Stills Gallery. And it actually opened almost in the month that the infamous Section 86 law was passed about encouraging homosexuality. But it was a fabulous exhibition done in two parts in our little gallery over the bakery on the High Street, curated by Alistair Foster, and looking at the male nude in photography from the beginnings of photography right through to the modern period. Yeah, I love this photograph, and I have it. This is a photograph by John Stoddart. You can see, so he's a Liverpool-based photographer, eventually became very successful, but he's a young chap at this time, and he captures this picture on the day when the Falklands War was, quote, won by us. And it's an extraordinary image, I think, with bits of Union Jack, the extraordinary look on the woman's face, the newspaper, again, an image that just holds so much in it. And it was very much of the moment. And so within a few months of it being taken, there it is in a gallery on public view, people's chance to think about it and what was happening around it. It was a rich, very rich time to be writing about photography and thinking about it and immersed in it.
Thanks, Robert. Shall we leave it there?
Let's. Thank you so much for your interest and your time.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks so much for participating in the Festival of Ideas. this recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which you can find through the festival website under the Watch Again tab. So thanks again, Robert, and goodbye.
Yeah. Bye.